collecting stories of people who live and work in the Permian Gulf, or pardon me, in the Permian Basin area, to kind of get an idea of what the impacts are around fossil fuel production, looking at health, social, and environmental impacts, as well as concerns that people have around the Railroad Commission and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ. And we wanted to talk to you due to your position and your recent experiences with the Railroad Commission. Very briefly, could you tell what do you do for in the area?
Yeah, so I'm a lawyer. I've lived in the Permian Basin since 2017. I've represented oil and gas companies, service companies, midstream companies, and more recently, landowners.
Okay. And has your has what you do changed as you move from representing the oil companies to the landowners?
Fundamentally, no. As a lawyer, we're hired to help our clients navigate the nuances of regulations and contracts and all that good stuff, right? And so I still represent operators. I still represent oil and gas companies. And fundamentally now what I'm doing is representing landowners in disputes at the Railroad Commission where they're having problems with oil and gas operations on their property and trying to get the regulators to do their jobs and enforce the rules.
Okay. And obviously I'm not going to ask you about any specific cases, but generally, what kind of issues are you seeing?
So I think, unfortunately, what we have now is we've got 70 to 80 years of historic oil and gas operations that in the Permian specifically, we're kind of out in the middle of nowhere and everyone has treated the land as disposable. And they're like, oh, it's not really worth anything. Even the regulators, Christy Craddock at a meeting a few months ago said, oh, I'm from there. And when showed a picture of Beamer Lake, she says, it's just dead. That's what it looks like out there, which is infuriating because it's not. And it used to be beautiful grasslands and overuse of the land and not having good stewardship of the land. Now we do have a lot of invasive species and things like that. But fundamentally, the Permian Basin is beautiful and everyone should be entitled to have clean drinking water, right? And so even though the oil and gas is the dominant estate under Texas law, they are only allowed to use what's reasonable and necessary of the surface, and they're not allowed to contaminate the groundwater ever. So if people adhere to those rules and we enforce those rules, we have an okay balance. We can have responsible oil and gas production. I firmly believe. I've represented operators over the years. When something bad happens, they step up, they do the right thing. It costs a lot of money to fix these issues, but we have to do it because it's the right thing to do. And so what I'm seeing in the Central Basin platform is an inundation of produced water from the development in the Midland and Delaware basins that flank it on either side. And now we've got to put that water somewhere because they can't re-inject it into the shale that it's flowing back from, right? That's the reason we have to frack wells in the first place. So, yep, we're seeing a lot of this produced water now. We inject it deep and it causes earthquakes, and they inject it shallow and it creates overpressurized zones where these old well bores that were poorly constructed at the time and have not been maintained are now what I call zombie wells and springing back to life.
What do you mean by springing back to life?
They are literally starting to spew water, oil, gas at the surface, at the subsurface, but wells that have been inactive or dead for decades are now no longer dead. And so that water and pressure is coming from somewhere. And the only viable explanation is the increased SWD or saltwater disposal wells that we're seeing across the basin.
Okay. And so this water comes up through these zombie wells, spreads out, and it sounds like Beamer Lake is one of those examples. And we've visited the site. We've seen what comes out. But is it safe to say that when that happens, it does kill the land. It does cause some of those contamination issues that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So, people, unfortunately, we've become very much a visual society, and our attention spans are very short, right?
Mhm.
And so with BP Macondo, for example, we got used to seeing that video over weeks of the oil, right, spewing underwater. Remember, all the news networks had this live stream. And then when you see things on fire, right, and if it's not on fire or spewing black stuff, people think, oh, it's not a big deal. We had a geyser in Crane County in January that Texas Monthly covered. So if people go Google Texas Monthly Crane blowout, it'll show, and it looked like Old Faithful shooting up into the air 150, 250 feet. But unfortunately, then you look around it and it looks like it's covered in ice. Well, that wasn't ice, that was salt. And there's a reason in the Bible they referred to salting your enemy's lands, because unfortunately, salt is even worse than hydrocarbons, right? Oil naturally degrades, bacteria likes it. Famously, you'll go out in the oil fields and people will say, oh, just throw some oil on it and the grass will be real green next year. Well, it will, because of some of the organic compounds in it, right? Now, long term, we can get into that. But salt is the big issue. And with that salt comes radionuclides like radium-226 and 228. And then even when you don't have the oil, a lot of oil, you still get the benzene, the toluene, right? All those, as my toxic tort professor in law school would say, methyl ethyl bad stuff. And it's these really nasty constituents that are present. And so unfortunately, over the past 50 years, federal law, state law, right, we've exempted a lot of these wastes under federal regulations. And there's always been an understanding that we keep the water and production in a closed loop system, and it's never supposed to go into the environment untreated. And unfortunately, Texas doesn't have a final rule. The Railroad Commission has never finalized a rule for what's a reportable spill of produced water. And so we've got literally thousands of barrels that will get spread onto the ground, and it kills the land for generations. You cannot grow anything there. And it leaches into your groundwater eventually, because unlike hydrocarbons that will dissipate and break down, the salt doesn't. It simply, it rains and it goes deeper.
So it kills the land, it contaminates the water. Are y'all seeing anything around air issues?
Well, I mean, your nose knows that there's issues, right? Unfortunately, and I think when we met in Odessa, right, I was saying I wanted to get a FLIR camera and get trained on a FLIR camera, because you can't see a lot of these vapors with the naked eye, and some of them you can't smell, right? I mean, when H2S is at a lethal level, you don't smell it. So when it's at a noxious irritant level, you definitely smell it. And we just saw that Waha went negative on pricing. And so what does that mean? All the flares come out because it's not profitable to get your natural gas to market. So even though I think we're averaging $5 MCF nationally for natural gas, in the Permian where we are, it was negative, and right now it's hovering at 5 or 6 cents. So it's bad.
Real quick, for people who don't speak oil field, can you briefly walk me through what Waha going negative means and how that impacts an increase in flaring?
Right. Okay. So Waha is a gas hub where natural gas comes in and is sold, and it's a pricing mechanism. So what happens is we've got natural gas pipelines, and let me back up, unlike oil that can sit in a tank, right? And when oil went negative, people go and they buy tanks and they just store the oil and wait. Natural gas doesn't. And so it'll explode, right? You can't just keep your natural gas hanging around. So you have to either flare it or put it into a pipeline. And right now, because of some scheduled, my understanding is there's some scheduled maintenance, but there's also some unexpected outages. And we have pipeline problems, which means there's not enough takeaway capacity where people are buying and selling natural gas. So you can't get it to where it needs to go. So that kills the market. And then that means that people have no incentive to put the gas into the pipeline. And instead, because they're having to accounting reasons and right? All of the different contracts and risk allocation in this market. And so unfortunately, what that means is people start flaring. And so I flew in to the Permian, a couple days ago, go Astros, and coming back from Philly, and everything was lit up. I mean, it was just, and unfortunately, that's the market that we have. And there aren't any consequences for flaring because the Railroad Commission grants flaring permits and exceptions all the time, and there's no penalties.
So going back to the permits and the exceptions, and you had mentioned something earlier about benzene and toluene being basically unregulated from the way that she put it. And I apologize if I misphrased that. Please correct me. What's the justification for all these exceptions? If it's accepted that these are toxics, that these do harm to the public in the state of Texas, what's the justification here?
Well, you really have to go back to the history of our environmental laws. And in the 80s, we really started to realize around dry cleaning and gas stations, underground storage tanks. And what would happen is they'd store these chemicals in underground storage tanks. They wouldn't maintain the tanks. They wouldn't have cathodic protection. So it rusts out, it starts leaking. And you had some really, really nasty chemicals, right, that were getting into groundwater and things like that. So the invention of RCRA and Superfund sites and all of these things, that's one path of regulation. And then we had a basic understanding in the US that oil and gas operators were exempted from more specific regulations that applied to other industries based on the tenet of making sure that your wells protect groundwater and having a closed loop system. When done properly, we don't release hydrocarbons and methyl ethyl bad stuff into the environment in the oil and gas industry. When done responsibly, everything's kept within pipelines and it's scrubbed, and you can have a truly closed loop system. And so there was an understanding, I think, back when all of this legislation was happening, that again, we're talking about the price of oil back then, and this was right after we had the Iranian crisis and right, all of this. And so if you look at the political implications and the pricing and the economy and all of this, it was, I think, a basic probably trade-off of environmental groups and oil and gas and economists saying, look, from a practical standpoint, we need this industry at a time in the 80s when they were just coming back from really horrific, shortages. We wanted to incentivize on a national security basis the exploration and production of natural gas and oil. And so they exempted it under RCRA and a lot of that. And so if you go and you look at current permits for injection wells, for example, and if you, wherever the waste comes from, even if it's got benzene, toluene in it, if it's from oil and gas operations and those things naturally occur subsurface, then they're exempted when they're kept in the stream of that closed loop system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So these came about in the 80s, these exemptions to changes to regulation. Is it time to update? And what would that take?
I don't know what we need to do. I've always said, I think the regulations on the books work when they're enforced. What we need is enforcement of the existing rules, unfortunately. And I don't think we need a ton of new rules. I think we need enforcement. And I think we need real penalties so that there's not a financial incentive to lie, cheat, and steal, right? If it becomes cheaper to lie, cheat, and steal than do the right thing, then you get people lying, cheating, and stealing, because even when they're caught, the repercussions are not as severe as doing the right thing. And that is a bastardization of regulations at its finest, right? So it becomes a shield instead of a sword. And so that's what I think we need to do, is actually enforce the rules on the books. And then we need to really consider and take care of where we put holes in the ground. 20 years ago, we thought we were at peak oil. We were worried about running out. Now we realize we've got 200 years of supply in the Permian Basin alone. And we also used to use whale blubber at one point in time, right? We need hydrocarbons. Natural gas is a great replacement for coal, but we need leaders and we need regulations that allow the good ones to use technology and to quickly adapt and to do it the right way. And we need to punish the bad ones. And then we need long-term planning for energy expansion in the future, because what's it going to look like in 100 or 200 years is going to be dramatically different, or it should be, than what it is today.
Right. And for people unfamiliar with Texas, we have a bunch of different regulatory bodies, TCEQ, the General Land Office, Parks and Wildlife in certain cases, but Railroad Commission is one of the big ones. Can you, and recognizing that this is a kind of a big question, who would have to get involved and actually start enforcing some of these regulations? And is there a place for federal regulation?
Yeah, so the Railroad Commission in Texas, despite its name, no longer controls railroads, right? They are the exclusive jurisdiction for oil and gas wells in the state of Texas. They also regulate intrastate pipelines. So all of these natural gas pipelines that go from the fields to the storage facilities, to the eventual power plants, other than the big interstate pipelines that are regulated by FERC, a federal agency. The Railroad Commission is the one that needs to step in and enforce these rules, and they just don't. And I think there's lots of evidence, and there's been lots of articles and discussion about how essentially they are bought and paid for by the oil and gas industry. They play favorites. They accept bribes. I mean, it's pretty bad. At least Russia admits that it's a dictatorship, and you get what you get. The real tragedy here is that we are pretending to be a democracy, and we're pretending to have capitalist rules that give everyone an equal shot. But in fact, crony capitalism is way worse than a dictatorship, because you are picking winners and losers under the guise of a free market, which is really deceptive.
Okay. Regarding pipelines, my understanding is that there are hundreds of thousands of miles of unregulated pipeline. Generally, these are called gathering pipelines. If I'm correct, they might run from, say, a wellhead to a gathering station or to a tank. Do those need to start falling under some of these other regulations? And what would that take?
Yeah, so gathering lines, and I don't want to misspeak here. I know enough to be dangerous. There has been more recently some additional regulations depending on the diameter of the pipe. And the Railroad Commission absolutely has jurisdiction over flow lines. They just don't do anything with it, okay. Right? And so if an operator has a leaky flow line, they're supposed to fix it. But if the landowner doesn't find out, or even worse, the oil and gas company has already destroyed the land, and so they've bought the land from the landowner, so they now own the minerals and the land, and they're operating on it, right? Then they essentially create a haven where there's absolutely no enforcement. Or like where I live on a 22,000 acre ranch, it would be a full-time job flying the property and walking these lines every day to try to spot leaks to be able to keep them. So yes, we definitely need some enforcement. And again, we need penalties. It shouldn't be that you just have free for all to spill and there's no repercussions. I mean, when we've got people that can't follow the rules, then we need to take away their license to operate.
We've been talking about the Railroad Commission. You recently ran for commissioner. What drove you to decide it's time to make a change and I'm going to run to try to make some changes? Your campaign, you had some interesting ideas, at least I thought so. Could you walk me through some of that process?
Yeah, so I have never wanted to be a politician. This is not like a lifelong dream. And I think you can go back and look at my social media history and know that I've never intended to run for office, right? So I moved out onto a cattle ranch in the summer of 2021. And after living there 10 days, an old well that Chevron had plugged in the 90s came unplugged, and it took them 12 weeks to replug it. And that's as long as it took them to plug BP Macondo after that in 2010. So I realized, and at first I thought, oh, good, it's Chevron. It's a reputable company. They'll step in, they'll do the right thing. And so I was naive. And so I spent several months out on location saying, well, why is this well so hard to kill? There were flows coming from places where flows shouldn't be coming from, questioning why Chevron didn't seem concerned, why the Railroad Commission didn't seem concerned. And so it took me months of being on the ground and seeing a response to an incident and realizing, oh, it's because Chevron knew that what was going on, and they just dumped this to a local small operator, intentionally, fraudulently covering up a subsurface blowout that's been ongoing for years. And they had had other wells that had blown out. They'd lied to the Railroad Commission saying that they owned the surface, so they didn't have to notify the landowner when they were plugging. Under statewide rules, you have to notify the landowner that you're going to plug a well. They didn't tell them about the spills. And I realized that it was never going to change unless we got somebody with real leadership into the commission that was willing to step up and say, look, this is hard. There's no easy answers here, but we have to do the right thing. And we've got to start taking meaningful steps. And so I ran not with the intention originally of winning. I knew that I was up against a political machine, especially in a state the size of Texas. I've always been a quiet Republican that just voted and wasn't participating in all of the drama, for lack of a better term, but couldn't stand by and let my state go to hell in a handbasket, quite frankly. I mean, it is really bad. And I also realized that as an industry, we're under attack from, I'm going to call them the left because there's not a better term, but from people who don't understand what it takes to make the light switches come on, right? So everyone, but I'm tired of the climate deniers. I'm tired of denying logic and science. And again, it's not mutually exclusive. And we are in a time of great technological expansion to where data and technology can prevent these things. And we can make cost-efficient measures and make educated choices of where are we going to spend tax dollars, where are we going to, attack these problems first that have the greatest impact. But if you don't have the intellectual honesty of people willing to say, we have a serious issue here and we've got to do something about it, then we're ruined. I mean, if we don't have groundwater, climate change is going to be the least of our concerns because we're not going to have any water to drink.
Well, you've preempted half of my follow-up questions, which is great. Real quick, I've only got a few minutes left on the Zoom call before they auto-kick me. You used a term earlier that I really like to talk about, reasonable, when talking about extraction, what is reasonable. So when we start using these kind of squishy legal terms, what is reasonable, what is expected, etc., do you believe that those need to be more specific, or are you okay with that kind of case by case basis almost?
I actually don't think we need to be more specific because what's reasonable and necessary changes over time, right? It used to be reasonable to use pits because we didn't have tanks when we were completing a well. Now it's no longer reasonable nor necessary to use a hand dug pit. We can do everything with tanks. And so, no, again, when the good operators that are out there trying to do the right thing, they're not using pits, they're using tanks because they realize they don't take a very short-sighted view. And the crazy part is when you do take a longer term view, the costs of renting a tank instead of digging a pit are actually less because you don't have long-term liability from leftover contamination, right? So no, I think again, if we update and keep with technology and just making sure that pollution's not going where it shouldn't be, and when it does, learning from those mistakes, and when they still don't care, penalizing them and taking away all of the financial incentive that they had for not doing the right thing, then things like reasonable and necessary take care of themselves.
So briefly, excuse me, briefly to summarize what I'm hearing, you believe that regulations need stronger enforcement. We need to actually start doing what the law says. And we need to be sure that we're keeping the byproducts, the pollution, the toxins, et cetera, keeping them under control and either disposing or using them properly.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's it.
Cool. Great. So I think we've got we've covered my questions at least. For the last thing that I want to ask, oil is the number one industry in the state, or fossil fuels in general. But the population doesn't live where it's produced, right? Most of Texas has never driven through the Permian, and it frankly is probably never going to drive through the Permian or the Eagle Ford. As someone who lives in the area, what do you wish people understood about the Permian that they just don't?
It's beautiful. Our desert's beautiful. Our people are beautiful. And the men and women who make our modern day life a reality, we are out here, and it's been generations of cattle ranchers and oil and gas people. And for years, it's been a symbiotic relationship, and it's worked well. But we now have, unfortunately, money people in places like Wall Street and Silicon Valley making decisions based on bottom lines and not understanding the operational realities of exploring for and producing minerals. Just like they don't understand lithium extraction for batteries, just like they don't understand, right, the youth labor in China making solar panels. No industry, no type of industry for energy is really green. That there are costs to the modern day conveniences. And I'll tell you, since I moved onto the ranch, I have dramatically changed the way that I live, trying to reduce my consumption. And that if we really want to have a change, no one wants to talk about it, but we're going to have to look at supply and demand. We're going to have to be more frugal on our energy consumption. And I used to love my little plastic water bottles. I don't use them anymore, right? Like, it's got to start somewhere. And it's going to take really big sacrifices from people in the cities. And if they don't want their lives to dramatically change, they need to get involved and stand up for those of us that do live out here. Because, like I said, it's our food supply, it's everything. And if we lose sight of rural Texas for the 90% that live in the cities, they're not going to have their city lives. So, yeah.